It all sounds so mysterious, except it's all true. It's not fiction. This is all real stuff that happens to Paul, which, again, an ordinary guy on this mission. When I came to Beacon Hills Community Church in 2006, within a few months, became very obvious to me that just something was not right. And I began to wrestle with, God, why did you call me here? Did I hear you wrong? Was this like, this is a mess. There's nothing I can do to change this. And as I began wrestling with it, I became convinced that God had indeed called me, and it wasn't a mistake that He called me into. And then it gave me the ability, because I believed in my call, to be able to go forward and begin to address some of the issues that I felt needed to be addressed. Paul has been attacked, he's been threatened, and now he's actually in a Roman prison. We're in Acts chapter 21, if you want to open your Bibles. And we'll see that he was convinced of two very important things. First of all, he was convinced of his call, that God had called him. And second of all, that's going to come out today, I think even more obvious than we've seen in the past, because he repeats it so often, is he's convinced of the resurrection. And the reason those things are related is because if you can believe in the resurrection, you can believe in the power that accomplished the resurrection to be able to provide for you, and the call that of God on his life to be able to do that. And so that's what Paul was able to do. Again, we're focusing on the ordinary lives of these people that are touched by the gospel, and how God uses them on this extraordinary mission, really to change the world. That's really, I mean, you can imagine Jesus starting with that small group of people, and the task of using just ordinary guys, not 12 Jesuses, not 30 Jesuses, not 70 Jesuses, but 12, 30, 70 ordinary people to change empires, to change the course of history. That's an extraordinary mission that God has called him onto. And that's what we've been studying through the book of Acts, and how that happens. So the Apostle Paul, at this point in the book, has been leading the charge away from Jerusalem. He's been on these 3 journeys that he's already finished. Here's the map here. He's finished these 3 journeys. And if you notice those journeys, they've been slowly getting farther and farther away from Jerusalem, but they're getting closer and closer to Rome as they go, which he feels very called to go to Rome. So after these 3 very victorious journeys that he's been on, also very dangerous, he's been stoned, he's been attacked, those kinds of things, in these major centers of the Roman Empire in the north, Paul returns to Jerusalem, and he returns with what has developed to be a Gentile version of Christ followers, Gentile version of the way, and they come to Jerusalem, and they come face to face with the Jewish version of the way, the Jewish version. And so all of a sudden we saw the what did we say last week? The Jets and the Sharks last week coming together all of a sudden. And what could have been a dramatic showdown becomes something really beautiful as this Gentile and Jewish version of Christianity come together and work together because they understood both their calling and their citizenship. That's what we talked about last week. Which I should say, by the way, last week, you guys shocked me with what we did afterwards, and I just want to say thank you. That was really, it took me days to kind of figure out actually what happened, because I was so stunned. I was trying to get the stuff packed up so we could get lunch, and I was like, why are they not packing up the sound system? We got to get it packed up. A little irritated, to be honest, and then humbled and embarrassed after that. And so thank you for that. That was really amazing. So as they're working together, Paul goes to do what he had intended to do. He brings this offering that he's been gathering from around the empire. He's been bringing that together for an offering to help those that are poor in Jerusalem, and for an offering in Rome. And he goes to worship in the temple. And as he's there, these Ephesian Jews recognize that he's there. They cause this riot. The Romans see the riot. They come out. They save Paul from being attacked. And Paul begins what are 5 defenses, and I've listed them here if you want to look at the screen, that we're going to cover today. The first of 5 different defenses that he's going to go through. And that's what we're going to talk about today as he defends not only his own ministry, but actually the gospel as being a fulfillment of what God had been promising from the very beginning. Daniel and your family, if you look at the U version under the beacon, you'll find all the outline and the photos and everything are all on there too. So the worship songs and everything will be up there as well. It's under the event section. So those 5 things, the Romans save him from the crowd, and they're about to, as they take him into the barracks, they're about to whip him because they want to figure out why is this guy causing such problems in the city. And right before they whip him, he pulls out his citizenship card and says, you can't do that. And so that actually saves him. They can't beat him. And so the rest of the book, most of the rest of the book, as you can tell, the next 5 chapters are these defenses. And that's what we're going to do today. Because of the similarity of the passages and the intent of these passages, we're going to skip over them. We're not going to read them all in detail, but yes, we're going to cover all of those passages today as we get through this. These trials end up getting Paul sent to Rome, which was exactly his goal. He didn't plan on going in chains. He thought he would go of his own volition on a mission, but he ends up going to Rome just the way he wanted to. And again, so as we approach these trials, I need you to remember just a couple things. First of all, the Holy Spirit warned him. But remember that one a couple Sundays ago, that's what we talked about. Week after week, every city he went to, there was prophets that were saying, this isn't going to be easy. So he knows what's going on. He knows this is, he may not know the details, but he knows that 1, God has called him, and 2, that this is what God has warned him about in the midst of it. And so as we said earlier, God is gracious, right? God is gracious, so I don't have to fear others. If God is the one that extends grace to us all the way to the fact that he's saved us, he's given us salvation, there's nobody else you need to please more than God. And he's given us all the grace that we need. So Paul doesn't have to worry about, as we sang before, defending himself. He's not preoccupied with that. So what more do you need than God's grace, right? He's got all that he needs. The second thing is his hope then is in, as we said earlier, the power of the resurrection. As we go through this, he's convinced that Jesus resurrected from the dead, and God's power did that, and God's power is the same power, that resurrection power, that has called him and protects him and guides him through the way. So what else, again, do you need beyond that as you go? So he's very confident in his call. The second thing you need to know is this, is that Paul knew he is called to Rome. We're going to read it later in Acts chapter 23, verse 11. The Lord stood before Paul. Can you imagine that? How would that be? The Lord stands before you. And he says, take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. God has called him to Rome. Keep that in the back of your mind. The third thing that you need to remember is that, who's writing the book? You better know this. We've been studying it for 9 months. Yes. Luke is writing this book. Why is he writing it? Paul is arrested and being sent before the emperor in Rome, and he's writing it during this period when Paul is under arrest. It's a several-year period of time, and so Luke has all the time in the world to go talk to these witnesses, bring them back, come talk to Paul while he's in jail. He has Philip is living in town there with his daughters. Everybody's right in that region. He can do all the research that he needs to do, and watch the way and who he documents these trials go for. And we're going to talk about a little bit why and how important that is. But remember, this is really a legal document in his defense of Paul as he prepares to go to Rome. All right, so Acts chapter 22 is where we're going to pick it up today. And that's the first trial with the Sanhedrin, beginning at verse 30. But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he bound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet, and he brought Paul down and set him before them. Chapter 23, verse 1. And looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I have lived up my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood before him to strike him in the mouth. So you got to understand who Ananias is first in this passage. First of all, yes, he is the high priest. Josephus, the historian, calls him a hoarder of money. So this is a guy who loved to have his hands in the offering boxes. He stole grains from the temple. People would bring their grain offerings, and they would put them in the temple. He would steal it. not even quietly. He would go in by force and just take what he wanted. He was just blatantly that way. He hired mercenaries to kill people. This is a religious thug and religious mafia. He is the definition of taking the Lord's name in vain. He abused his own power and the name of the Lord for his own purposes. So here's this guy who seems very offended by Paul's statement, right? That he has lived his life with a good conscience, claiming to be a good Jew. And so he has him slapped. Then Paul says to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck? This is kind of an odd statement because Paul's going to back off this in just a moment. So there's lots of conversation about what was going on here. Probably the best way to understand this is, the priest in his white robes standing there in this council. I think if you see in the room, this is very similar to what it would have been like on the Temple Mount up in the back part of Solomon's portico. They had an area where they would sit in a wide area in judgment. The Sanhedrin was like their Supreme Court. They had 70 judges that were appointed. And they're sitting there. So you have this guy that's at a distance. And remember, we think Paul had bad eyes. So Paul may not, in the chaos of what was happening, known who said strike him. And the fact that somebody struck him, he may not have known it, because he backs off on this in just a moment. And those who stood by said, who would you revile God's high priest? And Paul says, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of your people. So see how he kind of backs off from that. So he clearly didn't understand what was going on. So he apologizes for his response. Now, when Paul perceived that one part of the Sadducees and the other part were Pharisees, he cried out to the council, brother, I am a Pharisee, a son of a Pharisee. Now, that's an interesting thing, because I think all of us, based on the relationship Jesus had with the Pharisees, would say, well, how can Paul be a Pharisee and a Christ follower at the same time? And what you probably should understand here is that Paul never felt like he was leaving Judaism. He never felt. So it's not, being a Pharisee was not at this point about the doctrine of Pharisees that Jesus had a trouble with, but it was their interpretation of how to live under it and how they judged others, how they lived under the law, right? So very importantly, and most importantly in terms of doctrine, the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead. They believed that people could be resurrected, which is vital to Paul's belief. And the Sadducees, on the other hand, they believe in no spiritual world whatsoever. We actually have more in common with the Pharisees than we have with the Sadducees. We believe a lot of the same kinds of things about the spiritual world and things like that. So we are much more. So when Paul's saying he's a Pharisee, that's not a stretch of the imagination. For me, it's harder to believe that the Sadducees can even call themselves Jewish people, because they don't believe in a spiritual world. They don't believe in spirits or demons or anything like that. So that's a bigger question to me than if Paul can be considered a Pharisee. Paul continues, it is with respect to, here's the part that you underline, the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. Paul knows that this is the centerpiece to why this is going on, because guess who's in power? Not the Pharisees. There's a lot of Pharisees. The Pharisees were kind of the people's priests. They were the people's leaders. But the Sadducees were the ones that were in control of the temple. They ran the temple. They ran the religious observances of the temple, the sacrifices, the priesthood. Everything was the Sadducees. And again, imagine this in your mind. You have a people who don't believe in a spiritual world who are running the religious services. So you begin to see how this is a problem. But they're the ones in power. They're the ones in authority. And the Pharisees are kind of the balancing act on how they're doing things. So he says, it is with respect to the hope of the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And so this is what, again, gives Paul his hope as he moves forward. Christian hope is not a wish. Christian hope is a foundational belief. It's the thing that we know moves us forward. It's not like, I hope it's true. It's a cornerstone piece of what we believe that we know is true. And so that's when we say God is great, so I don't have to be in control. God is great. He's great enough to be able to bring about the resurrection. And so therefore I don't have to be in control. I can have hope in him. Verse 7 says, and when he said this, a dissension rose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, there's no angel, and there's no spirit. But the Pharisees acknowledged them all. And again, this is the thing that Paul anchors his future trials on. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes and the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply. Listen to this. We find nothing wrong with this man. This is going to be important as this moves forward, because the spiritual arm of if you had two political parties running, if you kind of picture it that way, I don't want to go too far down that because I don't want to, spiritualize our political parties. But that's kind of the way it was run, because they were a political power. And you had one political party that believed in all the spiritual things that we believe in, the resurrection and angels and spirits and those kinds of things. And then you have another one that's kind of an atheist, secular kind of a group that is kind of running things up there. And so this one group decides, they're like, well, we agree with Paul. What if a spirit spoke to him? They're like, what if that's what happens? So they come off, and the rest of the trials that we have coming up, keep in your background that a significant portion of the religious leadership of the one found nothing wrong with Paul. But guess who's in charge? The Sadducees. And that's why they're Sadducee, right? Because they don't believe in a resurrection. They don't believe in the spiritual world. And so those are the guys that are pushing for this trial of Paul as he moves forward. So they say that, what if a spirit or an angel spoke to him, verse 10, and when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and to take him away from them by force and to bring him into the barracks. So here's where the ball gets set into motion for Paul to get to Rome. This is the beginning of it. This is where it starts to roll. And it all comes down to this. The following night, the Lord said to Paul, take courage, for as you have testified the facts about me in Jerusalem, so must you also testify in Rome. God is gracious, so I don't have to fear others. No matter what happens, God is gracious, so I don't have to fear others. So in the rest of the passage, Acts chapter 23, the Jews get frustrated that Paul is there, and it becomes very clear that they're not going to get their way with him. The Romans are going to continue to intervene on his behalf. They come up with a scheme to ambush Paul and to kill him. They even bribe one of the Roman guards to be able to make sure this happens. Paul's nephew, and this is really an interesting comment, and there's all kinds of conjecture about Paul's family, but his sister is involved, and his nephew's involved, and his nephew hears what's happening, and he sends a message to Paul in prison. Paul is able to bypass the Roman chain of command and get the information to someone who can help him. And so as a result, verses 23 through 35, Paul is sent to the Roman provincial capital of Caesarea by the sea, where he is housed in Herod's old palace. And that's where he's going to stay for the next couple of years. For those of you that have been to Israel or will go to Israel, we do visit this place. The fascinating thing is the footprint of the palace still exists to this day, and they're discovering more and more of that as time goes on. Acts chapter 24 begins the second trial under a guy named Felix. And Felix is the Roman governor between 52 and 60 AD. Why is that important? Helps us to put a time frame on it. Helps us to anchor this in a place in history. He's a super cruel leader, and he is related to the emperor. So here is a very powerful man. This is not just another military guy that's been picked up along the way. Why is that important? Luke is writing a letter to the emperor. He's writing proof. And so you have one of his relatives that Paul has already sat before on trial. And they bring 3 accusations against Paul. Again, we're going to skip over some of these to just bring out some of the highlights. If you want to study these individually, that's a totally helpful thing to do. But for the purposes of what we're trying to focus today on, we're going to skip by these. There's 3 accusations. Verse 5, they say that he causes riots throughout the whole world. Now, notice that you have a political group or a religious group coming to a political leader. And so what's their first argument? He's making political trouble. He's causing riots throughout the rest of the world. Second charge is that he's a ringleader of the Nazarenes, which is also an interesting comment, because it means that these Nazarenes are a movement that's beginning to being recognized. It's powerful enough movement that being able to see what's there. There were other movements within Judaism. We could say denominations. There's the Pharisees and the Sadducees we've already talked about. There's the Essenes. There's the Sicarii. And now there's this other group Some called it the way, some called it the Nazarenes and stuff like that. They're calling it the Nazarenes here. So it's interesting that this Jesus movement is already beginning to be recognized by the politics and by the temple and stuff like that. And the third charge against him, verse 6, is that he tried to profane the temple. So how does Paul respond to that? First of all, in verse 11, he says, I've only been here 12 days. I didn't have time to, get riots started and stuff. I've only been here a short period of time. And I only came here to worship. I didn't come to do anything else. I didn't stir up anyone. I wasn't in a place to do that. In fact, I was in the middle of the temple. I was actually worshiping. There's no proof that I was there to start up anything. Verse 14 says, I worship the God of our fathers according to the way of Jesus, the Nazarenes, staying true. And he says, I stay true to everything the rest of the Jewish people believe, I still believe. Verse 14, but this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, again, we need to understand that it didn't mean what we would think of like a cult in this day. It would be another branch, like the Essenes, like the Pharisees and Sadducees. So that's what he's saying up there. They're calling it a different branch of Judaism, which is fine. But he says, I worship the God of our fathers. I believe in everything laid down by the law and the prophets. I have a hope in God. Why? Because of the resurrection, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. He continues, he says, I have a clear conscience. He said he didn't profane the temple. In fact, he was in the midst of an act of worship when they arrested him, when they caused this. He had brought an offering to the temple. He brought alms to the temple. And there's no proof except these guys who are from another country, these Ephesian Jews who, where are the Ephesian guys that are accusing me? Oh, they're not here. So here's what he brilliantly does, is a legal act. In Roman law, if you're going to accuse someone, you have to be there to make the accusation. Guess who's not there? So in terms of the court situation that's happening, they've kind of just made fools of themselves by not showing up, and all of a sudden put the ball in Paul's court. This guy really, if they're not willing to step up and show in court and show evidence to bring charges, they can't be very serious about this. So all of this puts it back in Paul's court. And he brilliantly shifts some of these conversations. You can see how his arguments, he knows what he's doing when he does this. Verse 21, he says, there's one thing, however, that I did say that eventually did cause some agitation. Other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them, it is respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. Not only is this a statement of his belief, but because he's very, this is going to be in every conversation he's going to have, he brings the resurrection into the conversation. But what he does here is he highlights the fact that the Pharisees already declared him to be not guilty. So this is a sect of Judaism that is disagreeing with another sect of Judaism. So is that a political conversation that the Romans need to judge? No. He's again, brilliantly highlighted the fact that this is a religious conversation, a faith conversation, a doctrinal conversation that the Romans really don't need to have their hands in. It's not a political one. Verse 22, it continues, then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. It's very obvious that this didn't have to go on anymore, but interesting, Felix was very acquainted with the way. Did you see that? So he makes this decision. It's interesting, and we'll talk a little bit in just a moment about why he was well acquainted. His wife was a Jewess, by the way, so she understood Judaism, and so he probably was learning from her. But he decides he's done, and he delays the decision to release Paul, partly, and he gives him certain freedoms. And so this is the time period, beginning with this, after this conversation. Paul is put in a loose kind of prison situation, a house church, or a house prison kind of a thing. House church, house prison. Didn't mean to say that. They're not the same thing. Please. So he's put in a situation where he can have visitors. There's always a guard present, but he can have visitors and they can write. So this is when Luke begins gathering all the evidence and putting together the Gospel of Luke and also the book of Acts. This is where all this begins to happen. Verse 24, Felix brings his wife in because his wife, again, is Jewish. She's also the sister of the king, King Agrippa, who we're going to talk about in a little bit. So you have a guy who's related to the emperor, and his third wife, by the way, they got married because Felix decided he fell in love with her. They were both married to someone else, so he hired a sorceress to make her fall in love with them. And so there's this whole kind of lust and self-control thing going on, and that's going to be important because Paul's going to address that. So she is his third wife in this whole thing, but she understands Judaism. And she's also the sister of Bernice, by the way. We're going to talk about Bernice in just a little bit. So there's lots of tangled webs going on here. So listen to how Paul addresses the two of them when he's talking to them. It says in verse 25, he reasoned about righteousness. Think about who he's talking to. Self-control and the coming judgment. And what's the response? Felix was afraid and said, go away from here for the present. And when I have an opportunity to speak to you, I will call you. So Felix is afraid of what Paul's saying. Something about what Paul is saying is striking a chord with him, not just because he's, some Roman guy, but because his wife is Jewish and she's been speaking to him. She's been whispering in his ear. We're going to find out because she wants to meet Paul too. So she wants to talk to him. And he's alarmed by his preaching. He hits some of those tender spots that are in there. And he kept him imprisoned, hoping for a bribe that someone would come along and say, hey, if I give you a basket of gold, would you let him go? But also, while Paul is in prison, he keeps calling him, and they talk regularly. They have these regular conversations. We don't know where those conversations went, but isn't that interesting? This guy keeps, that's one of those moments where God is great, so I don't have to be in control. He's in prison, and in the midst of it, a friend or a relative of the emperor is calling him for regular conversations, probably with his wife Drusilla along the way. And so who knows where those conversations can go. So the third trial, Acts 25, verse 1, is before Festus. The same charges are brought up against him. And Paul's defense is basically he's done nothing illegal. And so Festus ends up saying, hey, listen, I'm just going to send you to Jerusalem and let you judge it because this is a doctrinal thing. And Paul says, Paul knows if he goes to Jerusalem, he's dead. And that's actually what the plot was behind this, that they were going to kill Paul. And so he realizes he's in danger. So he pulls out his citizenship card and says, I appeal to Caesar. That leads us to the fourth trial before Agrippa and Bernice. Agrippa, who is Agrippa the second? We already read about him in Acts chapter 12. He's the guy who dies because everybody's saying, you're a god, and he doesn't deny it, and his stomach bloats, and he ends up dying from worms in his stomach, which actually happened in real life. Scripture is accurate on that. He's the one who killed James. He arrested Peter, and that's why Peter had to leave Jerusalem, because of this guy. He was the king of Judea from 41 to 44 AD. He was the last royal from the house of Herod to rule in Judea. He's the grandson of Herod the Great. He was raised, his father, Herod killed his dad, but sent him off to Rome because he was a friend of the emperor. And he was raised by the emperor in the emperor's family as kind of a stepchild in the emperor's family. He schooled with him. He was raised with Emperor Tiberius' son Claudius and became the friend of Claudius, who eventually becomes an emperor himself. Like every entitled rich kid, he spends money like water, gets himself in trouble, ends up running all over the Roman Empire trying to get away from his debts and people they're trying to call him. Despite scandal after scandal, the emperor, Tiberius, trusts him enough to have him raise his son. So think about that, like where that goes in terms of having the ear of the emperor. Remember, why is this being written? Luke is writing to prove to the emperor that people who know the emperor have heard this case and the emperor trusts. Here's a guy that the emperor earlier trusted him enough to raise his son, despite all of the scandals in his life. Claudius is a real work of art, but that's a whole different story. So he gets sent to prison because they hear, because he's friends now with the son of the emperor, and the emperor hears because he says, one day, your dad's going to die. You're going to be emperor. And so people hear him talking about that. So he gets sent to prison by the emperor, but then the emperor does die. And so who becomes emperor? The son he was hoping for, his friend. So his friend lets him out of prison and makes him king. He takes all of his uncles. His uncles were kings of other territories. He takes away their property and gives it to him, and they exile his uncles. So great family man at the same time, right? And he gives him the title of friend of Caesar. So he can literally say, some people do that. Yeah, he's my friend. He literally was given the authority to say, you're my friend, so that he could get the way he wanted with anybody. This is all about Agrippa. The reason I'm telling you this is because I want you to know, remember, Luke is writing this letter. So as Claudius, when Claudius dies, this is really a tangled web. Caligula becomes the emperor after Tiberius. Tiberius dies, and Agrippa happens to be in Rome, doing some of his political maneuverings as he is. He becomes the centerpiece person in getting Claudius. Claudius is hiding in the closet. The emperor's guards are trying to find him because they're going to kill everybody who has a claim to the throne. And he convinces the guards to call Claudius the emperor. So Claudius becomes the emperor because of Agrippa. Imagine the kind of I owe you one kind of conversations that they have after that. So Claudius becomes the emperor, and he gets all kinds of territories. And as a reward for that, the final piece of territory that he had that none of his other cousins or uncles had was Judea and Samaria. So he takes over the territory now. He's the king of all the territory that Herod the Great used to be the king of. It's the first and the last of them to have all that territory. This seems like a lot to give you, but you need to understand again the context of this trial and how important this is. He was considered to be one of the most powerful kings in the east of the empire, and he was considered the most powerful Jew in history. He had more authority. I mean, he was the one who crowned the emperor. So he was considered one of the most powerful Jews in time. He was called a friend of the emperor. And so can you see how this guy finding him not guilty could be important as he goes to his trial goes to Rome going forward? So verse 13, Felix explains Paul's situation to Agrippa. In verse 19, it says, rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Do you notice what happened? Felix understands enough about Paul's conversation, his documents, that he can quote the fact that it's a guy named Jesus who died and was resurrected from the dead. I don't understand all that stuff, but that's what's the point. So Felix has been talking with Paul. Remember, he said that was part of what happened. They had enough conversations that he understood it. Agrippa decides that Paul wants to hear it. He also understands, by the way, that the resurrection is key to this whole conversation. So the next day, Paul is tried by Agrippa, and Felix introduces Paul and says, and he pronounces in verse 25, I don't think this guy's guilty. I don't think there's anything that causes him to be guilty. And so chapter 26, we're moving pretty quickly, I hope you feel, through these chapters. Chapter 26 is really Paul's defense before Agrippa, the whole chapter. And it's interesting to me because we've heard several sermons from him already in this book. But what Paul doesn't give is a theological explanation to Agrippa. He gives him his testimony. And I think that's pretty powerful. So he begins by saying that he is known even by his accusers as being a good Jew. Verse 6. And now I stand here on trial because of my hope. His hope is in what? The resurrection. I stand here now on trial because of my hope and the promise made by God to our fathers. So what is he doing? He's tying his hope, the resurrection, back to what all Jews have always believed in, that there would be a resurrection. Verse 7, to which the 12 tribes hope to attain. He's tying his hope to the hope of all Jews, all the tribes, as they earnestly worship day and night. My hope is is the hope of our fathers in the 12 tribes. And he's saying, I believe what all Jews believe. And for this hope I am accused by the Jews, O king. Why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises from the dead? So for those of us that believe that the resurrection happened, and I trust that you do, it's amazing. It's stunning, the fact that the resurrection happened, but it's not incredible. Incredible means cred means to believe something. In means to not believe. So it's unbelievable. It's not incredible. And what he's saying to them is, it may be amazing, but it's not incredible. Does that make sense? Do you see the distinction there? And he said, so for the Jews that believe that resurrection is possible, Jesus' resurrection isn't incredible. It's awesome, but it's not incredible. But to a Roman, and the Romans do not believe in any sort of physical resurrection at all, it would be incredible to believe. But he's talking to a Jewish king and a Jewish queen. So they would know that. So if you believe in the resurrection, it shouldn't be incredible that it actually happened, because you believe that. And so that's part of the question for some of us is, some of us, we say we believe it, but do we actually believe that the resurrection is happening? Because that will make all the difference in the world. And again, Agrippa had a very colorful past as well before he became king. But after he became king, I already talked about his past, but after he became king of the Jews, he became very religious, and he took his role as the Jewish king very seriously. So much so that at one point, when the emperor wanted to put his statue in the Jewish temple, and it almost caused a war, he risked his life by personally going to Rome and standing before the emperor and saying, please don't do this. And so he stood up for Judaism and for what Judaism believed. And because of that, he was very respected by the average Jew as one of them. They believed that he was on their team. And so this is going to be very important, because Paul knows this. He knows that he's very respected by the people. And he tells them that in his past, Paul said, I was even a skeptic. So much so a skeptic, I went out after and I started killing people. And then he tells in verse 12 to 18 of his conversion on the road to Damascus, and that verse 19, all he's doing is living in obedience to what God called him to do. God told me to preach, and so I'm preaching. I'm just being obedient. Verse 21 says, for this reason the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me, and to this day I have had the help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying, both small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass, what all Jews believe, that the Christ must suffer, and that by being the first to rise from the dead, there's the resurrection again, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. When he gets to the resurrection and the fact that it was for all nations, that's when it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Verse 24, and as he was saying these things in defense, Festus said in a loud voice, Paul, are you out of your mind? Your great learning has driven you out of your mind. Again, it should not be incredible to a Jewish person who believes in the resurrection, but to a Roman who religiously is anti any kind of resurrection, it's incredible. And he says to him, Festus is like, what are you talking about? How could this even be? This is incredible to him. But Paul said, verse 25, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking true and rational words, for the king knows about these things, because he's a Jewish guy. He understands this. And to him I speak boldly, for I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe in the prophets? I know that you believe. Because he's been a defender of the faith, so he knows that he's been trying to be a good Jewish king in the midst. So this is his, like, do you want to come to the altar, King Agrippa? He's asking him, do you want to raise your hand and accept Jesus? He's not saying it in those words, but that's what's going on right here. And Agrippa prides himself on being a committed Jew, and so had Agrippa, the most powerful Jew in history, definitely in the empire at that time. This could have been a super powerful moment. Verse 28 says, and Agrippa turns and says to Paul, in a short time you would persuade me to be a Christian. He was getting there. And Paul said, whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day would come to be such as I am, except for the chains. So how close did he get? Well, we know that in chapter 12, it's recorded earlier that he dies a very prideful death. And so he probably did not come to Christ in his lifetime. But it goes to show when you're faithful, God will set up places for you to have conversations. Verse 30 says, "Then the king arose, and the governor Bernice and those who were sitting with them, and when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, 'This man has done nothing to deserve death or punishment.'" That's an important statement. Why? Most important Jew, most powerful Jew in the Roman Empire, probably in world history, and the friend of the emperor, the guy who crowned the emperor, for him to take that statement back to Rome. And guess what the other part of that is? If it's not true, and he writes it in the book and he sends it to the emperor, guess who's going to know it's not true? The emperor. He's going to find out really quick. And how would you like to be the guy that handed the emperor an intentional lie? No, that's too risky. You just can't do that. And Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." So again, you have Paul's innocence is declared by two of the most powerful men in the emperor, related to the emperor, friends of the emperor, the friend of the emperor himself. And again, remember, this is being recorded for this trial in Rome. It's powerful evidence. And so now we get to the now what. Again, we don't just read this so that we get smarter, that we know who these names are, we know how they fit in better. We do it because this is calling us to a place of discipleship, a place of obedience. Is the resurrection incredible to you? Not amazing. We all know it's amazing, the concept of amazing, but is it so incredible that you kind of have put it in that mythological thing that, yeah, well, maybe it didn't happen. Folks, there's a lot of people that go to a lot of churches that don't believe the resurrection. It's incredible to them. It's unbelievable. Thomas Jefferson pulled the resurrection right out of, literally cut the resurrection out of his version of the Bible because it was too incredible, because it was a miracle. It should always be amazing to you, but if you can't come to believe that it actually happened, you're never really going to trust in the promises of God, because if he couldn't pull off the resurrection, how's he going to protect you and guard you and provide for you in your situation? You'll never be able to grasp how amazing the salvation is that Jesus offers you. And like Agrippa, you're just going to get up and walk out of the room. The resurrection is an anchor to our faith. That's why we come back to it week after week with the Apostles' Creed. If you think it's too incredible, somebody here would love to talk to you. Somebody that you came with, somebody that you love. Even if you for years have believed in all the rest of it, but you're not quite there with the resurrection, we would love to talk to you about that, because it is so cornerstone. We would love to talk to you about that. Paul was confident in the resurrection of Jesus. If he wasn't, why would he keep it so central with these very important, influential people? He could have talked about all kinds of other things, but every single time he brought the resurrection as cornerstone piece of his argument. And so it was his hope. Belief in the resurrection gave him the ability to be confident in his call, and that the God who called him was able to provide the way for him to get all the way to Rome. They could have killed him at any point, but he was playing for an audience of one. God is gracious, so I don't have to impress others, right? He was just playing for an audience of one. Is the resurrection your hope? Does it give you courage and strength? Does it give you hope and joy? That is what it offers. Look at Paul as he went through these trials. He could stand before them and courageously speak spoke right past Felix, right to the king, the most powerful Jew in history, and directed and says, "I know what you believe. Let me just tell you what the implications of that are." Where do you need the power of the resurrection in your life today, right? Because it's not just a belief about power that exists in a book. It's about the resurrection power that lives within each of us and is available to each one of us today. And did you know that your testimony is a legit apologetic for the gospel? What God has done in your life makes you a witness. Have you ever experienced the work of God in your life? Then you're a witness. Any witnesses here? Hopefully, all of us. Yeah? You're a witness. God has called you. You qualify that. And your testimony is a good place to start. You don't have to have all the other answers, but what you can say is, I know that God has moved in my life. And it's you don't need to know his testimony, Paul's testimony. You just need to know your testimony and the power of God in you. Father, thank you so much that we can trust in you. We do believe in the resurrection. We stated it when we began the service this morning. And because of the resurrection of Jesus, we can go out with confidence and joy and in hope. We thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.